April 8, 1943, 27,000 ft above France. The oxygen mask couldn't hide Oberleutnant Ralph Hermichen's smirk as he watched the ungainly silhouettes climbing laboriously toward his formation through the crystal-clear canopy of his Focke-Wulf 190A5. The veteran ace of JG-26 studied the American fighters making their combat debut over occupied Europe. "The Americans have sent us flying milk bottles," he transmitted to his wingman, unable to suppress his laughter at the sight of the massive Republic P-47 Thunderbolt struggling for altitude. Below them, 16 P-47C Thunderbolts of the 4th Fighter Group lumbered upward in tight formation, their 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engines straining against their 7-ton weight. To German pilots accustomed to the sleek Spitfires and nimble Soviet fighters, these corpulent American machines appeared almost comical. Barrel-shaped fuselages topped with greenhouse canopies, wings too small for their massive bodies, propellers that dwarfed anything in the Luftwaffe inventory. What Hermichen didn't know, what none of the German pilots circling like wolves above could have imagined, was that they were witnessing the arrival of the weapon that would systematically destroy the Luftwaffe's fighter arm. Within 18 months, these flying milk bottles would transform from objects of derision into instruments of terror, their 8.50 caliber Browning machine guns becoming the most feared sound in German skis. The mathematics of destruction were already loaded in those broad wings. 3,400 rounds of ammunition, a combined rate of fire of 6,000 rounds per minute, enough concentrated firepower to tear a Messerschmitt in half in less than 2 seconds. The transformation began that April morning when Major Donald Bliley, commanding the 335th Fighter Squadron, spotted the German formation positioning for attack. The former Eagle Squadron veteran, who had transferred from RAF Spitfires just weeks earlier, understood what his men did not yet know. Survival in the P-47 required abandoning everything they thought they knew about air combat. The Thunderbolt represented a radical departure from conventional fighter design philosophy. While the Germans pursued lightweight interceptors optimized for climb and turn performance, Republic Aviation had created something unprecedented, a high-altitude juggernaut that used mass, power, and firepower to redefine the rules of aerial warfare. Among the 56 American pilots spread across the French sky that morning were men who would become legends, future aces whose names would strike fear into Luftwaffe hearts. But on April 8, 1943, they were novices in an untested machine, facing the most experienced fighter force in the world. The Germans had been fighting continuously since 1939 with veterans of Poland, France, Britain, and Russia. The Americans had been in combat for exactly 0 days. This story is about how industrial logic defeated tactical brilliance, how quantity and quality merged into overwhelming superiority, and how German pilots' laughter turned to terror as they discovered what synchronized Browning machine guns could do to an aircraft at 400 yards. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt had emerged from a June 1940 panic. As German fighters swept across France, Alexander Kartveli, Republic Aviation's Georgian-born chief designer, received urgent specifications from the U.S. Army Air Corps. They wanted a high-altitude interceptor capable of matching the Luftwaffe's best. What Kartveli designed instead was a monster that redefined the possible. "It will be a dinosaur," Kartveli admitted to his design team, "but it will be a dinosaur with good proportions." The XB-47B prototype first flew on May 6, 1941, shocking everyone who saw it. At 9,900 pounds empty, it weighed 65% more than its predecessor, the P-43 Lancer. The massive turbo-supercharger system, with its complex ducting running through the rear fuselage, gave it an almost pregnant appearance. Test pilots approaching it for the first time invariably asked the same question: "This thing actually flies?" Not only did it fly, it flew like nothing else at altitude. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine, an 18-cylinder radial producing 2,000 horsepower, could maintain full power at 27,000 ft where German fighters gasped for air. The turbo supercharger, fed by exhaust gases, delivered sea-level performance in the stratosphere, where the air was too thin for conventional superchargers. Major Hubert Hubzink, commanding the 56th Fighter Group training at Bridgeport, Connecticut, initially despised the aircraft. His unit lost 18 pilots and 41 aircraft in training accidents between September 1942 and January 1943. The P-47 killed more Americans in training than Germans would in the first months of combat. It ground-looped on landing, torque-rolled on takeoff, and dove with such enthusiasm that pilots discovered compressibility, their controls freezing as shock waves formed on the wings. But those who mastered it discovered something extraordinary. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, a farm boy from Oklahoma who would become one of America's top aces with 27 victories, described his first flight. It was like strapping yourself to a locomotive. The power was unbelievable. You didn't fly it, you aimed it. The first combat encounters in April and May 1943 confirmed every German prejudice. The P-47s couldn't turn with Focke-Wulf 190s, couldn't climb with Messerschmitt Bf 109s, couldn't match their nimble handling at medium altitudes. Luftwaffe pilots quickly developed tactics to exploit these weaknesses, attacking from below where the heavy Thunderbolts struggled, forcing turning fights where agility mattered more than firepower. Hauptmann Joseph Pips Priller, commanding officer of JG-26, reported to headquarters after his first encounter. "The new American fighter is meat for the slaughter. It flies like a truck, turns like a freight train, and climbs like a pregnant cow. Our boys are calling them Indiana, fat targets pretending to be warriors." The statistics seem to confirm German confidence. In their first month of operations, the American fighter groups lost 14 Thunderbolts for only 3 confirmed German kills. The RAF, observing from their Spitfire squadrons, quietly suggested the Americans reconsider their choice of mount. British pilots joked that the best evasive maneuver in a P-47 was to unstrap and run around the roomy cockpit. But something strange was happening in those early encounters that German intelligence failed to notice. The P-47s that were shot down had absorbed incredible punishment before falling. One aircraft returned from a May 4th mission with 21 cannon holes and over 100 machine gun strikes, damage that would have disintegrated a Messerschmitt or Spitfire. The massive radial engine, lacking vulnerable coolant systems, shrugged off hits that would have stopped a liquid-cooled fighter cold. More significantly, when P-47s did get their guns on target, the results were catastrophic. The Thunderbolt's weapons battery created a convergence zone of destruction that German pilots had never experienced. Unlike rifle-caliber weapons of early war fighters or cannons with limited ammunition, the American fighter could maintain sustained fire for over 30 seconds, an eternity in aerial combat. The event that began changing German perceptions occurred on June 26, 1943, over L'Oiseau, France. It involved Second Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson of the 61st Fighter Squadron in an encounter that would become legendary. Johnson's formation of 48 P-47s was returning from escort duty when they were bounced by 16 Focke-Wulf 190s from IIJG-26, led by Headman Wilhelm Ferdinand Galland, younger brother of the famous Adolf Galland. The Germans executed a perfect attack, diving from the sun with overwhelming speed advantage. Johnson's Thunderbolt, flying at the rear of the formation, was caught in the crossfire of multiple attackers, taking catastrophic damage in the first seconds of combat. 20 cannon shells exploded across his aircraft. The canopy shattered, hydraulic fluid sprayed into the cockpit, the engine cowling was torn away, and fire erupted behind the instrument panel. Johnson, wounded in the nose and leg by shrapnel and bullet fragments, tried to bail out, but the canopy was jammed. A 20 shell had exploded in the canopy track, welding it shut. He was trapped in a dying aircraft at 27,000 ft. What happened next defied every assumption about combat damage tolerance. Despite having no forward visibility through the oil-covered windscreen, a barely functioning engine that shook violently, and controls that responded only intermittently, Johnson managed to level the aircraft and point it toward England. The P-47 continued flying with damage that would have reduced any other fighter to falling debris. Then it got worse. A lone Focke-Wulf 190, flown by an unknown pilot from IIJG-26, discovered the crippled Thunderbolt limping toward the channel at less than 170 mph. Historical research has never definitively identified this pilot, though several names have been proposed based on German combat reports from that day. What followed was one of the most extraordinary encounters in aerial warfare history. The German pilot positioned himself behind Johnson's P-47 and opened fire with his 20 cannon and two 13 machine guns. Johnson, unable to evade, could only huddle behind his armor plate. The Thunderbolt absorbed the entire cannon ammunition load. Then the German repositioned and fired again, this time with only his machine guns. The cannon ammunition exhausted, the German pilot pulled alongside, staring in disbelief at the flying wreck. He pulled alongside again, emptied his remaining machine gun ammunition into the Thunderbolt. Still, it flew. Johnson's P-47 landed at Manston with its engine failing on the runway. The crew chief stopped counting bullet holes after reaching 200. One cannon shell had exploded inches from Johnson's head. Another had detonated against the armor plate behind his seat. The engine had taken direct hits. The control cables were partially severed. 3 of the 4 main longerons, the structural backbone of the fuselage, were shot through. Yet the aircraft had brought him home. The survival of Johnson's aircraft sent shock waves through both air forces. American engineers studying the wreckage realized they had underestimated their own creation. German intelligence, receiving combat reports from IIJG-26, initially refused to believe it. No aircraft could absorb that much punishment, but testimony from multiple pilots confirmed the impossible. The P-47's combat debut over Europe marked the start of a slow, almost imperceptible shift in air superiority. Initially, Luftwaffe pilots believed they could exploit the Thunderbolt's weaknesses: poor turning performance, sluggish acceleration at low altitude, and unwieldy size. They called it Indiana, a fat target that could be dispatched with conventional energy tactics. But the Americans discovered something their opponents underestimated. The P-47 thrived on altitude and speed, using its mass, climb, and diving characteristics to dictate engagements. Colonel Hubert "Hub" Zemke, who would later command the legendary Fighting 56th, summarized the philosophy succinctly. "We don't turn with them. We climb, dive, and punch. The P-47 isn't a nimble girl, she's a hammer. We swing with precision." The early months of combat were a baptism by fire. From April through September 1943, the 4th, 56th, and 78th Fighter Groups escorted bombers over France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Losses were high. Pilots learned quickly that the P-47 required discipline, patience, and understanding of energy tactics. The aircraft could dive faster than any German fighter, recover from spins more predictably, and absorb hits that would destroy a Messerschmitt or Focke-Wulf. One remarkable example occurred on September 10, 1943, during an escort mission over Bremen. Lieutenant John C. Mayer, flying his Wicked Witch, was separated from his squadron after a mid-air collision damaged his wing. Alone, he engaged a flight of 8 FW-190s, diving and climbing to maintain energy advantage. Mayer shot down 2 attackers in less than 3 minutes, while sustaining more than 50 hits from cannon and machine gun fire. He returned to base with a shattered canopy, bullet-riddled fuselage, and a malfunctioning tail wheel. Reports described the aircraft as a flying junkyard that somehow refused to die. Meanwhile, German fighter command struggled to adapt. Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s dominated early war skis due to superior maneuverability, but the P-47 negated these advantages at high altitude. Luftwaffe pilots developed tactics to counter the Thunderbolt, including head-on attacks and ambushes from below, but these were costly and only partially effective. The American emphasis on formation flying, gunnery discipline, and coordinated energy attacks made individual Luftwaffe skill less decisive. The Battle of the Ruhr in March 1944 illustrated the transformation. Hundreds of P-47s escorted bomber formations against industrial targets in Germany. Luftwaffe pilots recorded increasing frustration. Even when they succeeded in downing one Thunderbolt, another 2 or 3 would immediately counterattack. Bombers survived in greater numbers, and German fighter losses mounted. The P-47 had become the embodiment of industrial and tactical synergy, combining mass production, firepower, and survivability with intelligent pilot doctrine. By mid-1944, the Allies had refined long-range escort tactics. P-47s, now equipped with drop tanks, could accompany bombers deep into German territory, further eroding Luftwaffe effectiveness. Fighter groups transitioned from defensive escort to offensive sweeps. Known as fighter-bomber missions, attacking rail lines, convoys, and airfields. The Thunderbolt, initially derided as a lumbering brute, had become a versatile, lethal weapon across multiple theaters. Casualty statistics underscored the shift. Between June and September 1944, P-47 pilots claimed over 1,000 Luftwaffe aircraft destroyed for roughly 200 Thunderbolts lost. The aircraft's rugged design allowed downed pilots to survive crashes that would have been fatal in other fighters. Stories abounded of P-47s returning to base with wings sheared off, fuselages holed by enemy fire, and engines barely running, yet landing intact. The aircraft's durability became almost mythical. One example involves Lieutenant William Allen of the 78th Fighter Group. His aircraft, the Flying Coffin, absorbed more than 300 hits during a mission over northern France in July 1944. The landing gear collapsed on touchdown, yet Allen survived with minor injuries. Mechanics later joked that the P-47 had taken more punishment than the Luftwaffe had inflicted in a month. In addition to combat performance, the P-47's industrial story is remarkable. Republic Aviation delivered more than 15,000 units by the end of World War II. Every aircraft incorporated lessons learned from its predecessors: reinforced airframes, improved turbochargers, self-sealing fuel tanks, and enhanced armament. The result was a fighter that could be produced in large numbers without compromising quality. Allied strategists understood that this combination of quantity and survivability would ultimately overwhelm Germany's dwindling resources and veteran pilot corps. The human dimension of the P-47 story is equally compelling. Pilots who mastered it often expressed a love-hate relationship with the aircraft. They admired its power and resilience, but respected its quirks. Landing required skill. Torque from the massive engine could flip the aircraft if mishandled. Spins were brutal without careful control. Dive brakes and hydraulic systems demanded constant attention. Yet once a pilot learned its rhythms, the P-47 became an extension of himself, a machine that trusted the skill of the man, not just his reflexes. American training programs evolved rapidly. Fighter schools emphasized gunnery accuracy, energy management, formation discipline, and damage control. Pilots learned to exploit the P-47's strengths while mitigating its weaknesses. Those who survived initial tour often became instructors themselves, creating a feedback loop that rapidly elevated the skill level of the U.S. Army Air Forces. The cumulative effect was devastating to the Luftwaffe. Experienced German pilots, already depleted by years of combat, faced an aircraft that could not only survive their attacks but also strike back with overwhelming firepower. Morale suffered. The psychological impact of encountering the P-47, especially those like Johnson's heavily damaged aircraft returning seemingly intact, was immense. Pilots began to describe the Thunderbolt as a flying fortress in fighter clothing. By late 1944, the P-47's presence over Europe symbolized the inevitable decline of Luftwaffe air superiority. While German engineers developed advanced fighters like the FW-190D and Me-262 jet, they could not compensate for the sheer numbers, ruggedness, and pilot proficiency that American Thunderbolts brought to the theater. The P-47 had transitioned from a lumbering curiosity to a cornerstone of Allied air power, a machine that exemplified the marriage of industrial design and tactical innovation. In retrospect, the P-47's legacy is profound. It redefined the concept of survivability, forced a reassessment of air combat tactics, and contributed decisively to the Allies' strategic bombing campaign. Pilots, stories of endurance, courage, and skill illustrate that victory in the skies relied not just on technology, but on human adaptation and ingenuity. From the laughter of Oberleutnant Hermichin in April 1943 to the awe of German pilots observing returning Thunderbolts, the narrative of the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt is a testament to the interplay of engineering brilliance, tactical evolution, and sheer human resilience. By war's end, what began as a flying milk bottle had become a legend, a weapon that epitomized American ingenuity and determination. And in the sky over Europe, that legend continues to inspire awe.